So I'm here today with Joyce, who looks after a daughter with an eating disorder, and I'm Amy Harrison. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I work with families on the inpatient unit at the Bethlehem Hospital in the eating disorder unit. And Joyce and I thought that we would make this recording to share with you some of the information about the carer support that we have on offer and how we work with families and loved ones across the eating disorder services. And also to think a little bit about some of the challenges that families and carers might experience when supporting loved ones with eating disorders. So hopefully we can address some of your queries, some of your questions, some of your worries as you engage with our service. So thanks so much for joining me today, Joyce. I guess one of the first things I wanted to share was how we as a service understand the role of families and carers and supporters. And the first thing to say is that a carer could be a parent, could be a sibling, could be a partner, could be a friend, could be a colleague or a neighbour. It's really anybody that our patients would like to involve in their treatment. So we sometimes talk about carers, sometimes we use the word supporters. And what was it like for you to hear that we were interested in you being involved in your daughter's treatment?
Well, actually, when Hannah, my daughter, was an inpatient at the Bethlehem, I did actually engage with all the support on offer. I was in an incredibly anxious state at that particular point, and I think partly because she'd moved from CAMS to adult services, and that transition was a really difficult one. But actually, I found it was my way of trying to do my bit to help her and to try to get on the same page with the way the treatment was going. I did all sorts of. I think I remember doing one training, which was 3 or 4 days. I think I came back for several days, and it was actually really helpful to meet other families in the same position. One thing I would say was there were husband and wives or partners and siblings who'd come, and it was really nice to not just get one person from the family. And I think, in fact, often you got a different angle on things as well when there were husband and wives or a carer, maybe a sibling, in these meetings. And I actually did find, although there wasn't an instant, it didn't instantly solve the problems of trying to mend my daughter, who was actually very, very unwell. But it calmed things down by using some of the techniques which I did use for a long time and actually still use in other forms to this day. So
it sounds like you learnt lots of different skills, and one of the things that we're really interested in sharing with carers is our understanding of kind of what keeps eating disorders stuck. So if you perhaps come to a session with us or come to one of our workshops, we'll often talk about what we know from the science and the research into kind of why eating disorders become stuck as habits and the effects of starvation on the brain, and try to help families to understand that there are lots of different reasons why these things happen, and actually families are part of the solution. They're sort of part of the problem. And also, as people interacting with a loved one with an eating disorder, and I don't just mean a family member or a friend, but also sort of professional carers, I guess, on the ward or in the outpatient service, for example, our interpersonal sort of interactions with patients are really important. So what we like to think about is how we can understand some of the cycles that sort of happen, and think about whether we can unpick these a little bit and teach them different communication styles and strategies that could help perhaps the eating disorder become a bit quieter, or maybe a bit less necessary for the person, or a bit more manageable for the family. So we really see that supporters, families and carers are absolutely part of the solution. Do you think that we conveyed that to you, Joyce, when you took part in some of our support?
Yes, I do. Although I do think the family therapy side really did convey that, and I thank you for that. I think what I felt very conflicted about was that when Hannah first came into your services, she had transitioned from child from the child and adolescent services to the adult services, and the sort of method of helping, of us as carers helping, just changed so fundamentally. And I found it very hard to grasp that change and to deal with it. And I got a lot of support through the family therapy side. And I think we also did some emotional coaching work as well with another lady, I've forgotten her name now. And all that really helped. But I think because she'd gone in at such a young age, that transition meant that I engaged in everything I could, but I didn't think, I still found it quite a tricky place to be, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
But I think certainly on her second admission, when she was engaging a lot more, then I began to sort of buy in more myself and I guess step back a bit more. So it is almost about putting trust in other people in a system. And it's really do when the parental intuition inside you is shouting and screaming at you. So it's a tricky place, but yes, I really welcome the family therapy. And the techniques were frustrating at times. I'd go home and I'd fail completely in actually my ability to do them. But then I'd realise I hadn't got it right, and I'd try again next time. And the whole sort of listening and really understanding what was going on in my daughter's head. Once I really realised how awful it was for her, because I really did listen, I then started to really realise that was what I could do to help, just to listen and to validate and tell her what I thought she was saying. And then the more I did that, eventually she did open up more. But it was almost moments that she didn't open up for very long. So it wasn't a sort of, let me pour my heart out now, you've mastered these techniques. It was much more a little snippet, and I think, yes, I'll hang on to that. It was, it was a long process. I read a lot of books as well. I read Janet Treasure's book, and it became my Bible. And I was every one of those animals at some point in time, even all on the same day, I think is probably how I could describe myself. But actually I could sort of see that it was giving that sort of nudge from behind, and that was really what my role needed to be.
Yeah, you've really picked up on an important point for families or carers who might be sort of accessing adult services for the first time and coming from the child and adolescent context. And the idea that their role might be a little bit different perhaps, or I suppose the role that their loved one wants them to play might be a bit different. And that's something that families often share with us, that when they've been in the child and adolescent services, they've often had an experience where they've had to sort of take charge of sort of the food environment, of eating, of meals, and then it can be a bit sort of confusing in a way, because they're coming into adult services and they're hearing things like confidentiality and perhaps being asked to take a slightly different, or to consider a slightly different role, maybe where their loved one is asked to take a bit more responsibility. And I can really see how that must be quite daunting, quite mind-blowing in a way, coming from sort of one context to another. And we've been trying to do a lot of work around this, sort of having a better transition into the adult service, and trying to be very transparent about how we would work together. I think our model is very much about collaborating with families, bringing them into the treatment team, but working with them to take on a role of kind of supporting and coaching and enabling their loved one to make changes when they're sort of ready, willing, and able enough, rather than I suppose the family member sort of taking the lead, so to speak. Of course, there are times when risk trumps all, doesn't it, where we really do have to step in and be extremely directive and make sure that the person's safe. But generally, I think in adult services, what we're trying, the sort of spirit and the ethos of the work is about empowering the patient themselves to take care of their nutritional health, to look after their mental health, to be compassionate to themselves, and to have the skills to sort of look after themselves. And some of those skills will definitely involve getting support when necessary. But yeah, I think we're sort of asking families to not provide all the solutions, but to help their loved one to come up with their own solutions and support them to put those into action. So yes, I can imagine that can be quite different from previous experiences of treatment.
Yes, I think it was, and I think it's interesting with now that we're sort of through the worst, and Hannah's actually very, very well at the moment, and it's now I can look back and think actually I can see that need for her to take responsibility for her own illness, but I guess I think the transition needs to be smooth somehow, so that when you're leaving the child and adolescent unit, there's a bit of preparation, and then you don't have to do it at a certain. Hannah did it on her 18th birthday, which actually I don't think that makes sense, because mentally she was still a child. She'd been ill for quite a while. So I think just making that a bit flexible, if that's possible. But I do also see this need to make them take ultimate responsibility, because Hannah didn't start to get well until she took that responsibility.
Yeah,
I think that is really significant, and this notion that as a parent, which is really inside me, I must be able to fix this, but actually you can't, because they need to fix it. And I think that was it took me a long while to appreciate that. But I guess once you start to see some small signs, even if they're tiny, you just need to praise them. Everything, whatever that small thing is, it is a monumental step, and realise that. So, and then it sort of grows. And I actually felt I could almost feel it's like somebody got a whole load of jumbled wires in her head, and each one had to be thought through and worked out where it went.
It's a lovely metaphor.
It's an example, and actually I could see that she was eventually doing that herself, with me nudging along and encouraging. Yeah. And she had some really low points and some really bad days, but I think there were enough good days for her to see that if she kept at it, something would change. And I think it's not for the faint-hearted. It's a long journey.
Yes, eating disorders can take a really long time to back off and to leave the person alone. Absolutely. And I think that's another reason why we need supporters around us. If we're poorly with an eating disorder, it's very hard to recover on your own.
Yes, I think it is. And I think also the family support and the sense of the optimism of a family, or the hope and the aspiration that life will be different, is actually the thing that they really, really need. And if you give nothing else, if you're giving that hope and you're sort of saying, come on, we can do this, and you're going to be enjoying life in a much better place at some point in time.
Yeah.
They sort of half believe you and half not. But I think just sticking at that, conveying that message is the thing to do, because I think along the way, because it can be a long journey, you can get very jaded. And I think families, they can step back and say, well, actually, this doesn't work. The system is geared for them, and I'm not involved, or whatever. And they can lose that role, which actually I think is the most is the most damaging thing to happen. And if I could say anything, it's that as a families watching this, just keep involved. Just don't necessarily just nudge along behind, but just be there and be supportive and be there for every move, because actually you are their lifeline.
Definitely. That sounds like amazing advice, Joyce. Thank you. And I can hear from you sharing your experience that some of the skills you learned from the family work that we provide and the carer skills workshops that we run, where you get an opportunity to practice skills with other carers, have been really important, because they've allowed you to sort of take a little step back, not have to fix it all, but to actually have discussions with your daughter where you're sort of trying to really understand her perspective, get into her shoes, offer that empathy, make sense of her position and the importance of the eating disorder for her, and also use skills like open questions and giving praise to help her to come up with new ways of doing things and move towards that recovery. And those, you know, for people watching this, if you're wondering what we do in our carer skills workshops, these are the sorts of skills that we'd be sharing. So we'd be explaining how to ask open questions, how to reflect back what your loved one's saying, how to give them positive feedback, how to sort of summarize and reflect on what they've been sharing with you, and how to do that in a way that helps to bring about change, because we know that these sorts of communication styles help people to get a little bit unstuck, be a little bit less stuck in the illness. Whereas I guess people don't change generally if they're sort of just told to. We generally change when we come up with our own reasons to do so. And so that's I think the key role that we see for loved ones in our work. And you also mentioned sort of emotion, working with emotions, and that's another thing that we cover in our workshops is how to help your loved ones identify their emotions, label them, and how to offer them empathy around that and meet their emotional needs, because we really do think that eating disorders are sort of emotion regulation difficulties, and people use behaviors like restricting their food, or maybe binging or purging or exercising or using laxatives as ways of sort of managing emotions and then managing difficult situations. So our work's very much about trying to offer different sort of communication around different interactions, I suppose, in relation to the eating disorder. Because as you mentioned, we know that eating disorders evoke very strong reactions in others, and these are just natural responses to a very confusing and kind of complex illness. And we talk about those animal models that you mentioned, and we use metaphors to try and make sense of the reactions that eating disorders evoke in all of us. And you're right, I've had all the animals in one day as well, sometimes in the same sort of hour, because eating disorders, that's just how they make us react. So we're trying to be thinking together about what that's like and how tough that can be to you know, have an eating disorder that's making us very anxious, or making us very angry, or making us very frightened, or just making us want it all to go away. So we use those animals to try and describe those reactions, and then think about what useful responses might involve. We talk about the dolphin and the Saint Bernard, and how these, like you say, you know, just gently nudging the person. They might be a bit there in the background sometimes they might be sort of alongside the person. So we try and think about how to match our support to where the person's at. And that's something we'd be helping you to think about in the workshop with other families who are going through the same thing. I mean, Joyce, how useful was it for you to be in the workshops with other families and hear about their experiences?
I found that invaluable. I really did, and I think this is interesting as well, because I'd like to get the male and the female perspective carer, because often a lot of there are more often mums there than husbands, although obviously were partners did come, but actually it was so useful to get the dad's perspective on some of this, because they not all, I'm making a huge generalization, but in my experience, some of them were able to offer very good support in a more detached way. Whereas I certainly felt in my own case, I was very emotional about the whole thing, and the emotion sort of got in the way of being constructively helpful. So I found it really interesting to watch some of the role plays when a man was doing them rather than a woman, or even, you know, a sibling or a partner. I just found it really reassuring, and each time I watch other people, I learned something. And also, you sort of think you may have got the technique, and then you realise when you try to do it in front of a group that you haven't. But I think also it was a really good exercise just to engage in listening to what other people in the room are thinking and saying. And if I learned anything on the whole process of all those family therapy sessions, and what all the oars and all the stuff we did, it was to listen, and to listen, really say, actually what I'm hearing is this. Let me just recap and tell you how it's coming across to me, and can you confirm that's what you're saying? And I think doing that and letting them letting them say things which could sometimes be really shocking, was really tough. And my daughter still will say that she didn't say things to me for fear of my reaction. And again, it's about learning to tone down that reaction to enable them to say the stuff that's really awful. And I think for me, doing all that listening and engaging, it suddenly hit me. I mean, it was awful as a carer, and I was struggling in all sorts of ways myself, but it was 10 times worse for my daughter. And to suddenly realize that, and to realize the fear of being down this awful hole that you knew you had to try and climb out of, but you couldn't on your own. It was just, I think I suddenly didn't need to pretend to be empathetic. It was, the empathy was there. And
because you'd been able to really carefully listen and make sense of your daughter's experiences. Yeah, it's very powerful.
I remember once, quite early on, when she was, I think, still in adolescent treatment, I remember her saying one day that she was lonely, really, really lonely, and totally isolated. And she was lonely because the eating disorder had control of her, and she couldn't get out of it, and she was really scared. And to suddenly really see that was heartbreaking, but it was also recognizing that actually it really, really was a very horrible place to be, and that we had to empathize and understand and sit alongside her as she tried to navigate her way out of it. Yeah, which luckily she did. So.
It's really sort of important. I think that's one of the things that we try and share in the workshops, that people can and do recover from this, and we run the workshops together often, so that families can talk to carers that have sort of been through this experience themselves, and also people like your daughter who've experienced the treatment as well, do join the workshops and explain things from their perspective. So that's another thing that people might expect, I guess, to encounter in the workshops. But one of the things I'm thinking about, Joyce, from what you've just shared about how painful it was for your daughter, is also how painful it is for loved ones seeing their loved one, for people seeing their loved one, you know, experiencing this disorder and being afflicted by it, I suppose. And we know that it's very powerful to be able to know that other families are going through this too. and that you're not on your own, and that people are out there thinking about you, and you know, have got through this. And I think one of the things that I find to be really important about the workshops is where we talk about the rights of carers, really, because we know that from the NICE guidelines, families and carers, you know, regardless of whether their loved one wants them involved in their care and treatment, they do have the right to their own support and information. So that's really what these workshops are trying to achieve. So sometimes families might be worried about, you know, will personal things be shared about my loved one, or you know, will they know that I'm coming to these workshops? And generally we of course want people to be transparent and to work together, but it's okay to come along to the workshops even if your loved one perhaps doesn't want you involved in their care and treatment at the moment, because you have the right as a carer to get that information and to get that support, and that's something we've worked very hard to get into the NICE guidelines, because we know that that's really important. Because eating disorders don't just affect the person, they affect people around them, and that's not the patient's fault, that's just a facet of this horrid disorder. But one of the things that we try to convey in the workshops is how to start looking after yourself. And we talk about, you know, if you're on an aeroplane, and they sort of do that demonstration, don't they, where they say put your oxygen mask on first before helping others. And so we do think that's a really important concept, that we kind of nourish you as family members, as carers, with skills, with support, with information, so that you feel able to do whatever it is that might be needed to support your loved one. And what was that like for you to hear that we think your self-care as a carer is really important?
Well, I think the whole thing about self-care takes a while for you to digest, because you're so consumed with caring for your loved one that you can't get any perspective on it. But on one of the carers workshops that I did, an ex-service user came in to talk, and I remember this vividly because it really did hit a note with me. And she said that the eating disorder made her demanding of her family's attention, and her father was a trombonist, and he played in a local band. And instead of coming to see her on whatever it was, Wednesdays and Fridays, he'd said, no, I can't come Wednesdays and Fridays because I play in the band and I'm not coming. And she said, it made me realise that his life mattered and that I wasn't top of the list. And that was a very positive experience for her, because it made her realise that actually they're all getting on with their life and I'm stuck in here not getting on with mine. And I really took that on board, and I tried. And often I was pretending, but I tried to sort of go and do stuff on my own. So I'd meet friends, did a lot of meeting friends, walking. I've always been a walker. But also I deliberately, at certain points, made a point of telling my daughter that actually I'm going away to do this, go and help a friend on the farm with the lambing, and I go every year. And even when he was very poorly, I said, no, this is my time, I'm going to go and do this. And I think that resonated, because I think it also made her realise that some of the things we as a family were doing, she couldn't do because she wasn't well enough. And so I remember being told in one of the early sessions that I should still go on holiday, even though she was in the inpatients. I was horrified, thinking I can't possibly go away on holiday. And I remember my husband saying, yeah, we really need to still go. I don't think we did go. I think I just couldn't quite get myself to go. But I could see now that actually we needed to go away and have a break, and she would have been safe where she was. And it would, again, it also might have made her think, actually, they're going on holiday without me. And I'd like to be there doing whatever they're doing, because we're quite an outdoor family. We've done a lot of sort of walking and cycling, and she's a very good cyclist. So and I think that resonated when we go off and say, no, we're going to Kent for the day to do a bike ride. It was hard to do it. I'm not saying,
I imagine, yeah.
I'm not saying I found that at all easy, but this ex-service user with her trombone dad really resonate, and that's what some of these groups do. They sort of suddenly somebody says something, and you think, actually, I'm not doing that. How can I do it? And yeah, there are lots of little things like that in those groups, which I just sort of came away thinking, I need to stop doing this thing that I'm doing and think differently. And I think one of the other things that the groups made me realize is all these things are techniques which are helpful in some places, but they're not all mandatory. And if something's not working and you're flogging away trying to get it to work, and it's just making the situation worse, then stop. And sort of and don't feel guilty about stopping doing it. Yeah, so there were lots of which didn't necessarily come out of the actual teaching of the oars and all that sort of stuff, but just sort of conversing with people and getting a bit of an understanding. It really did help. And I think in the end, sadly, carers, if this illness goes on for a number of years, they do become experienced and they do understand the illness. So actually they can share things amongst themselves, which may or may not be helpful. Who knows? I mean, and it's interesting because to this day, you never know what suddenly made the shift in.
Yeah.
And would it have come whatever you did, or would it have come stepped out completely? Who knows? But I guess for me, it's all about keeping that hope and that optimism, and also one of the things that the groups also taught me was to spend time with Hannah and ignore eating disorder and just do whatever you normally do, and even have sort of mum and daughter rows that you normally do because actually that's normal life, isn't it? So whereas we spent so long walking on eggshells.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us, Joyce. And I hope that anybody watching this who's a bit reluctant about what these workshops might involve or what carer support in the service might sort of be, has a good sense now of how we might work together as professionals here in the service with you as loved ones, and indeed with your loved one. So thank you very much, Joyce.
It's a pleasure.